everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm all the way in Australia talking to you tonight at the Eyes on Eye Care meeting. My name is Dr. Monica Jong, and I am the Global Director of Professional Education Myopia at Johnson & Johnson Vision. I've been working in many areas of myopia and formerly led the International Myopia Institute. And I'm super excited to be here and to be joined by leaders in the field, Professor Mark Bullimore and Dr. Stephanie Ramdas, who will now introduce themselves.
Well, thanks, Monica. It's great to be sharing the stage with two of my outstanding colleagues. I'm a British trained optometrist and PhD, but I've spent most of my adult life in the US. I'm a recovering professor of optometry, having spent a lot of time at Berkeley and at Ohio State. I've also taught and spent time at Houston and Southern California College of Optometry. So maybe some of my former students are online today. I spend most of my life now consulting with companies big and small. So you'll see my conflicts of interest statement in a minute. So over to you, Stephanie.
Hi, everybody. Great to be on this international platform here. My name is Dr. Stephanie Ramdas, and I spent a lot of my beginning years of my career in the US, specifically at Mission College of Optometry, where I was in more of a research-based position. I wanted to bring a lot of kind of that skill set that I had developed looking at the field of myopia management back to Canada when I moved to Ontario in 2018 now. And then opened up a practice in the middle of COVID in 2020. So looking forward to contributing to our team today and then bringing in some of those cases and introducing how I incorporated myopia management into my practice. So Monica?
Thanks, team. So let's kick things off.
Thanks, guys.
So today we're doing a COPE course, and we'll be following these learning objectives. I'll be talking about why myopia matters, and that will cover 3 of these dot points. And then Professor Bullimore will be talking about the monitoring myopia as well as the evidence base for the treatments. And then finally, Dr. Ramdas will be taking us through patient cases. And these are our disclosures. So I'm an employee of Johnson & Johnson Vision, and you can see Professor Mark Bullimore's long list, and Dr. Ramdas has her own private practice. So why manage myopia? Well, firstly, myopia is the greatest threat to eye health of the 21st century, and it was only in 2015 that it was first recognised by the WHO as a serious public health issue. At this meeting that I was lucky to be part of as the scientific secretary, there were 34 experts from every WHO region of the world who discussed and debated about myopia, the evidence, the classification, and the treatments. We had Professor Earl Smith, the former Dean of the University of Houston, representing the US. A report was published about this meeting, and this report drew a line in the sand that myopia was no longer a traditional refractive issue and needed concentrated efforts to bring it to the wider audience of policymakers, practitioners, and government bodies and peak health bodies. This was then why the International Myopia Institute was started. The International Myopia Institute are a group of 150 experts coming together to bring the evidence of all of myopia together in the form of white papers and to educate and make aware all the issues surrounding myopia in the form of these white papers covering topics such as myopia management guidelines, interventions, prevention and progression. And you can see the images of our task force chairs who led these white papers, and Professor Mark Bullimore is also joining this prestigious group to lead the next white paper in adult myopia. And the whole point of the IMI is to really create awareness so that in the future there will be less vision impairment and blindness from myopia-related diseases. So why myopia and why now? Well, myopia is increasing in prevalence around the world, everywhere. And today we know that it is an important issue in terms of permanent vision impairment and blindness with increasing levels. And we also have the ability to do something about it today. In 2016, myself and the team at Brian Holden Vision Institute published this paper that reported that the myopia prevalence was going to increase to 50% of the world by 2050. And that's about 5 billion people who will be developing myopia. Now, high myopia will affect about 10% of the world population, or about 1 billion. And you can see from the trend line that high myopia prevalence is doubling every 20 years. And in the US, by 2050, we will have as much myopia as what Asia is seeing now. And that's pretty frightening, because 60% of the US population will likely have myopia, and almost 15% will have high myopia. And this means that as practitioners, we're going to be seeing a lot of myopia. We need to be trained to manage it, provide the comprehensive eye health examinations, the low vision services, and there'll be a lot of people needing surgical correction as well. Sorry, surgical interventions for myopia-related complications. If we look at this map of the world, we can see that East Asia has the highest prevalences of myopia now, up to about 90% of 15-year-olds in Hong Kong, and around 97% of South Korean military conscripts have myopia. But it's not just an East Asian problem, because we're seeing USA seeing prevalences of almost 50%, as reported by Dr. Vitali. And this prevalence jumped by almost twice, doubled in 3 decades. And in Southern California in 2013, almost 15% of 5 to 7-year-olds had myopia, and close to 60% of 17 to 19-year-olds had myopia. And the recent lockdowns during the COVID pandemic in East Asia reported that there was a clinically significant increase in myopia in young children. And this suggests that lifestyle is playing a really big role today. Now, the reason why myopia matters a lot is because every diopter increases the risk of ocular pathology. So you can see from this table that even at the lower levels of myopia, you have a higher risk of developing things such as Marpic macular degeneration, retinal detachment, as well as becoming permanently vision impaired. Now, the risks increase exponentially once you reach the higher levels of myopia, such as -6 diopters or more. But the risks are at every level. And so every diopter matters, and we should be detecting myopia and managing every child that develops myopia immediately. This chart here shows that every diopter increase in myopia increases the risk of Marpic macular degeneration by 67%. Now, Marpic macular degeneration isn't really very well known by the general public, and it's a condition that people tend to think happens more frequently in Asia, except it's also a frequent cause of vision impairment and blindness in places such as Rotterdam or Copenhagen. And so we need to really be vigilant. Every diopter of myopia also increases the risks of things such as retinal detachment, posterior subcapsular cataract, and primary open angle glaucoma by about 20 to 30%. So moving on to risk factors for myopia. So how do we know who's going to develop myopia? We know today that genetics is playing a lesser role in the more garden type variety of myopia. The largest modifiable risks for myopia are things such as time outdoors, near work, and education. And that's because we see now in studies that with children who spend less time outdoors and spend more time on near work, they have a much greater risk of developing myopia. So this figure on the slide in the red box at the back shows that children that spend very low time outside and spend a lot more time on near work have about a 14 times increased risk of developing myopia over 5 years. And the children that spend a lot of time outside and spend a lot of time on near work, they only have a 2 times increased risk of myopia, the blue box at the front of the graph. So outdoors seems to have a protective effect against myopia, and clinical trials in places such as Taiwan and China have demonstrated that by spending at least 2 hours per day outside has reduced the risk of developing myopia by about, well, has prevented new cases of myopia by about 50%. So you can delay or prevent myopia onset by spending at least 2 hours outside, of course, with sun protection. In terms of near work such as reduced near work distance, less than 30 centimeters, as well as more than 2.5 hours per day, tends to increase the risk of developing myopia as well as progression. And when we look at genetics, if you think about genetics as being something that loads the gun, but the environment fires it, then you realize that we can do a lot by changing lifestyle, advising, more time outside and less near work, such as the 20-22 rule, which Dr. Caroline Claver put forward to help people remember. So every 20 minutes, look into the distance, 20 feet, and spend 2 hours per day. So there is still a familial or genetic component, because we see that the risk of myopia tends to be a little bit higher in those with 2 Marpic parents compared to 1 Marpic parent, and those with parents with high myopia also tend to be more at risk of developing myopia. And then we see that the prevalence of myopia tends to be higher in certain ethnic groups, such as East Asians versus African Americans or Caucasians. And that could also be because in East Asia, there's differences in the environment and the education and the culture towards these aspects. But one of the biggest predictors that we can use to help us determine if someone is likely to develop myopia, the strongest predictor is reduced expected refraction with age. So if you see a child whose hyperopia is reducing over time, or their hyperopia is less than expected, then this child is on their way to developing myopia. We would consider them as pre-myopic, which I'll go over in a minute. So the current evidence, however, does not point toward a role for accommodation and binocular vision issues in myopia development and progression. Binocular vision and accommodative divergence issues need to be corrected, and good binocular vision is important because we need clear vision as well to prevent myopia from progressing. But just because you're correcting BV issues doesn't mean that you're going to prevent myopia from happening. So as I mentioned, the definition about premyopia, this is when the refractive state of the eye is about plus 0.75 diopters to less than minus 0.5 diopters in children, where they may also have other baseline refraction, age, and quantifiable risk factors. So if a child, for example, is 6 years old, they should have hyperopia of plus 1 diopters. If you see that 6-year-old child and their hyperopia is plus 0.50 diopters, then you could consider them premorphic. And it means that they're likely to develop myopia, and providing them with lifestyle counselling such as reduced near work and increasing time outdoors will be very helpful. And other risk factors, if you see a child whose refraction is changing over time, but they're spending more time indoors, studying more, they might have parental myopia or other genetic risk factors, then you could also consider them premorphic. So this table here is quite helpful for us to predict who will develop myopia. And as I mentioned, age and level of hyperopia expected for age is one of our best predictors about who will develop myopia in future. These are the classifications of myopia, and you can see that they are all based on the spherical equivalent of refraction when ocular accommodation is relaxed. So low myopia is when it's minus 0.50 diopters to less than or equal to minus 5 diopters. And for high myopia, we consider it minus 5 diopters or more. But it's important to note that all myopia carries the increased risk of ocular pathology. So when we have a child that's diagnosed with myopia, how would we explain to them their expected prognosis? We know that the biggest predictor of the amount of myopia progression is age. So if a child is younger, then they're going to progress a lot faster and for a longer length of time. And that's why we do need to start treating myopia earlier, because if we treat them earlier, they'll progress for less and they're less likely to reach the higher levels of myopia. So you can see here the red line is a child that's 8 years old developing myopia. By the time they're 17, they're estimated to be over -6 diopters. But if a child is developing myopia at the age of 12, in the pale blue, they'll progress for a shorter period of time, and they'll also progress at a slower rate, and they will be estimated to reach -3 diopters. So once again, age of onset is the main predictor of the final level and risk of high myopia. And a recent study published by Dr. Donald Moody reported that once a child becomes myopic, their eyes are going to continue to grow, and the degree of refractive error almost certainly increases. So waiting for prior progression before you treat, don't do that. It doesn't really help because they're highly likely to progress. So that comes to the end of my session, and I'm going to hand it over to Professor Mark Bullimore now, who will be talking about monitoring myopia and the treatment options and the evidence for it. Over to you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Monica. I do apologize if my voice craps out a little bit. I'm on the downside of a little COVID encounter, so I'm feeling much better now, but I'm 2 weeks out, so I've still got some residual upper respiratory things going on. So let's talk about how we might measure myopia, and we're going to come to this a couple of times, but the next slide, Monica, you got to advance my slides for me, thanks. We've got two ways of measuring myopia. Obviously, we define myopia and we typically measure its progression by refraction. And but obviously, structurally, a myopic eye is myopic because of abnormal axial length. And certainly those of us who conduct or are involved in clinical trials prefer axial length for a number of reasons. And I'll revisit this in a little bit later on. But the resolution is substantially better than what we find for refractive error. So if we think about monitoring myopia, I get a little peeved every now and again when somebody talks about normal progression being about half a diopter of myopia, because what you can see from the green cells on this table, those numbers vary depending on two important factors. One is the age of the child, and the other is their race. So if you've got a young child, progression is going to be much faster, and a 7-year-old on average is going to progress twice as fast as an 11-year-old. And that's independent of the age of onset. Monica showed you some nice data of that a few minutes ago. The other thing that is important is that Asians tend to progress faster. So you can see this perhaps more clearly in the top when you look at axial elongation. You're seeing that there's about a 30 or 40% faster axial elongation rate in the Asians compared to the non-Asians. And by Asians, I'm talking about East Asians who look like Monica, and not so much the South or West Asians who look like Stephanie. They tend to behave a little bit more like the Caucasian and other populations. So you need to put this in context when you're thinking about, is a child progressing at the normal rate? So if we go to the next slide, we can think about how often we should be monitoring outcomes. And certainly, if you've got a child in contact lenses, you want to check in on them regularly. Same with atropine. How are they doing? Are they any problems arising? But really, we want to evaluate progression based on 1 year of data because there are seasonal changes. And I'll maybe come back to this in a minute, because children, we know, progress more faster than in the winter months than they do in the summer months, and that's perhaps due to outdoor time. But every 12 months is probably sufficient. But if you have a fast progressing child, checking their axial elongation more frequently than that may be something you want to consider if that's available to you. So we have a range of calculators out there, and Monica has been involved in the development of some of these. I like to tell people that you can use these, but use them with caution. They are great at the point of sale, if you like, the point of prescribing or the point of your myopia control pitch, in showing a parent what the likely evolution is going to be in their child. And these calculators, particularly the BHVI calculator, allows you to put in the current prescription, the race of the child, and their current age. And you'll be able to see what the likely trajectory is on average for that particular child. And that's very useful because then the patient, or sorry, the parent can put it into perspective of their own refractive change and think about, well, is the child going to get to be as worse as I am, or are they going to get to be worse? Now, where I exercise a little caution is the green line on the calculator you can see hidden there, which is the slowing or the progression of myopia with treatment. We don't have a lot of long-term data, and you have to be very cautious not to oversell the prescription or the modality that you're prescribing for this particular child. But as I said, the untreated prediction that you can get from these calculators is really, really useful. So let's talk about myopia management. And I'm going to go through, from a very much an evidence base, the various options we have available to you. And there's no clear evidence that one is better than the other. We haven't done a lot of side-by-side trials. And as you can see, the efficacy of, say, a spectacle depends on the type of spectacle lens that you're prescribing, likewise for a soft lens. The efficacy of atropine depends on the concentration. So you need to put these things all in perspective. And what I'll come back to at the end is you need to be the doctor. You need to think about what would work best for this particular child and have a discussion with the parent and the child of what might be the best. But like any other spectacle prescription or contact lens, you do need to make recommendations and you do need to prescribe from the chair. But it's important to consider lifestyle choices, just like with progressive edition lenses that I wear. It's important to consider those things when you're making a recommendation to the patient and their parent. So, as I said, we live in an evidence-based world, and this is what we call the evidence-based pyramid, and the highest standards of evidence are at the top, and the lowest standard of evidence is at the bottom. Okay, so expert opinion is just that, opinion. Okay, and the person may or may not be an expert. They're just offering an opinion. At the top of the the top of the pyramid, we've got randomized clinical trials. And most of the data I'm going to present to you today on the efficacy of different modalities is based on randomized clinical trials. Now, there is actually an even higher level of evidence, which we call meta-analyses. And that is where researchers gather together multiple sets of publications, preferably randomized clinical trials, combine the evidence to come up with a more compelling case as to whether the modality, the treatment, is efficacious or not. And of course, down the bottom, we could add something else to the pyramid, and that's, of course, social media. And if the last 2 years have taught us anything, we shouldn't rely on social media and politicians when it comes to healthcare decisions. So let's move along to thinking about this in the context of myopia control. So some of my colleagues at Johnson & Johnson and myself published this very long paper last year. It's about 30 pages long, but there's a lot of information there evaluating efficacy in myopia control. But to synthesize some of the things that we say in this paper, there are certain things that we'd like to see when we're looking at studies of myopia control methods. We like to see a randomized clinical trial with preferably at least 2 years of data. We like to see masking. And remember, in the eye care world, we call it masking. We don't use the word blinding, okay? But we like to see masking, preferably double masking, where both the patient and the person making the outcome measurements are masked to the treatment. So of course, if we're doing a soft lens trial where we've got different soft lens designs, we can mask the child. But of course, if we're looking at orthokeratology versus spectacles, we're not going to be able to mask the patient. But nonetheless, we should try and have the patient making, the practitioner or the clinician or the scientist who's making the primary outcome measures, we'd like to have them masked so we can eliminate bias as much as possible. Now, as I said before, we can measure progression in two ways, refractive error or axial length. Now, when it comes to refractive error, our preferred method is to use cycloplegia and to use autorefraction. Okay, now obviously we don't prescribe from an autorefractor, but in terms of measuring progression, it's a much more repeatable method, and of course it's unbiased compared to a subjective refraction. So we like to use cycloplegic autorefraction. We also like to measure axial length, and we have all these new fabulous optical biometers available to us that use OCT or interferometry technology, and these are extraordinarily precise. But when we think about progression, we should think about the two being correlated. We would expect the two to show good agreement, and generally speaking, 0.1 millimeters of axial elongation corresponds to about a quarter diopter of myopia progression. We're currently evaluating that ratio in a large meta-analysis of research papers, but that's a good thing to remember. The other thing, and I have a strong personal opinion about this, is when we're talking about efficacy, we should talk in millimeters or diopters. To use percentages can be very misleading because it's very dependent on the population that you're studying, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But let's think about a little bit more about why axial length is the preferred method of measurement. And of course, the answer is the complications that Monica alluded to that occur in higher levels of myopia are nothing to do with the thickness of a patient's spectacle lens. They're related to the increased axial length and the stress that that places upon relative components within the eye. So let's think about that a little bit more differently, or so a little bit more deeply. So on the next slide, I'm just looking at my notes here. These are some of the reasons why we believe axial length is the metric of choice, particularly in research, and it's probably moving that way in terms of clinical care. Now, your inability to measure axial length shouldn't prevent you from getting into myopia control, but somewhere down the line, you're going to want to measure it either in your office or in collaboration with one of your cataract surgeon friends who's got one of these toys. So when you look at recommendations from the IMI, and Monica used to be the queen of that organization and maybe still has a role to play, and also what the FDA say, axial length is very important. Disease association, that I sort of crudely showed you on the previous slide, but when you look at the relationship between visual impairment and axial length and refractive error and put them all into a single statistical model, axial length comes up significant. And once you account for axial length, myopia is no longer significant. So it plays a much more statistically profound role in the relationship with visual impairment. And another soundbite to take away from you, from this presentation, each diopter of myopia is associated with a 30% increased risk of visual impairment. Okay, so not only is increased diopters of myopia associated with disease, it has a profound relationship with visual impairment as well. As I said already, axial length is relatively more sensitive than measuring refractive error. And also these nice optical devices that we have, these optical biometers, they don't require cycloplegia. So you can take more frequent measurements without needing to cycloplege the child. But most importantly, it's important to remember that axial length is not affected inadvertently by the treatments we use, but refractive error is. So take the case of orthokeratology. You flatten the cornea with orthokeratology, so you can no longer accurately measure the patient's myopia. So you have to rely on axial length to monitor progression in orthokeratology. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Likewise with atropine. Atropine is a very strong antimuscarinic, and it's messing around with the eye's accommodative apparatus. And we see that in some of the clinical trials, that you get a short-term hyperopic shift, if you like, when therapy is introduced. So again, you must rely on axial length in clinical trials of these therapies. Now, one of the sort of acronyms that we've come up with to describe this sort of cumulative treatment effect is a thing called CARE. And I may have that on some of my slides, but you can think about that as the absolute treatment effect. And it's the cumulative absolute reduction in axial elongation over time. And the reason my colleagues and I like that and like using this absolute treatment effect, preferably in terms of millimeters, is that it's constant across age, the underlying progression rate, and race. Percentage treatment is not. So you might get the same slowing of axial elongation in a young Asian child as you do in an older Caucasian child. Okay, that's what the data show us from the literature. But in terms of percentages, they will appear very different. So if you want your percentages to look good, you might recruit older white kids, okay? So that's why percentages can be misleading. Now, it's nice to talk about 50%, 60%, okay? But we should use it only sort of in passing. We should think about when we're comparing treatments and looking at benefits over time, the absolute treatment effect or the CARE that we get in millimeters or perhaps even diopters. The other thing, of course, is that our absolute treatment effect should accrue over time. So we'll get more treatment benefit the longer we administer it to the patient. Ironically, percentage treatment actually diminishes over time. And the reason for that is shown in the next slide. Because when we look at treatment effect over time, we see that the greatest treatment effect for pretty much anything we try occurs in the first year. So this is a graph that I'm going to show you in multiple forms over the next 20 minutes or so. And what it shows here is the cumulative absolute reduction in axial elongation over time. And these are studies, clinical trials, where there are at least 2 years and in some cases 3 years of data. And what you can see is the lines aren't straight. They have a sort of dogleg to them because the maximum or the greatest treatment effect occurs in the first year, and then you get a slightly diminished effect in the second year and third year. And it doesn't matter what you're using, whether it's atropine or a soft lens, we see that all the time. So on the next slide, I'm going to colorize that graph, and the pink is atropine. And what you can see, the highest or the biggest treatment effect is for 1% atropine, but some of the least effective treatment effects are the low concentration of atropine down the bottom, okay? And the green is ortho-K, the red is soft lenses, and there's sort of dotted blue lines of spectacles. And I'm going to talk about those in greater detail. But what this graph allows you to see is how different therapies behave relative to one another. So let's go on to the next slide and think first of all about lifestyle guidance. Now, outdoor activity is something that we know can influence the onset of myopia. And we've seen this from studies in Australia, Singapore. Actually, the first data came from the US. And we see that the greater time that a young child spends outside, the lower the incidence of myopia. Okay, now there's less compelling evidence between outdoor activity and progression. But the benefits of this is it can be part of a larger public health message. Okay, it's a cheap thing to do, and a healthy lifestyle can not only lower the incidence of myopia, it can be good for cardiovascular system, obesity, diabetes. So it's a really good thing that we can get behind as healthcare practitioners. So it's not quite clear to us how this works. Is it the light level? Is it the color of the light? Is it the optics? Is it the change in pupil size? But the effect is quite compelling when we look at the onset of myopia. So on the next slide, some data to sort of consider. People have shown a sort of 0.15 millimeter slowing of axial elongation. Now that includes myopia onset as well as progression, but there's percentages, maybe a 9%, in some cases a much higher reduction in the incidence of myopia over a period of time, where schools have programmed additional outdoor time during the school day. So that's one area where a difference can be made. But of course, there's also the weekends and the evenings during the summer where we can encourage children to spend up a lot more time outdoors. So let's move on to other things. And I'm going to talk first of all about optical treatments. And we have a range of treatments available to us, but the things that work are generally based on this peripheral defocus theory. Now, in a normal myopic eye, you end up with an image shell where the peripheral image is actually exposed to hyperopic defocus. But what we want to do with our optical strategies for slowing myopia progression, we want to produce myopic defocus, okay? And the things that work generally follow that. Now, why do we care about the periphery of the eye and not the central retina? Well, this comes on the next slide for some really exquisite animal work from my friend and colleague Earl Smith. And he and other people have demonstrated that in very young animals, be them chickens, guinea pigs, tree shrews, or monkeys, the development of the eye, the refractive development, is regulated by visual feedback. If you take away visual feedback, that normal development is disrupted. And critically, if you put a minus lens in front of the eye will become myopic. If you put a plus lens in front of the eye, it will become hyperopic. But some of the key findings in this area include firstly, the fact that the fovea is not essential. So if you get rid of the fovea, you ablate it with a nasty laser, the eye will still respond to those plus or minus lenses, okay? The next thing that's important, and this is critical for myopia control, when you have conflicting optical signals between the fovea and the periphery dominates. Now that may be because there's more of it, but the periphery overrides anything that's happening in the fovea. And finally, and this is important for our dual focus strategies, when you have conflicting signals in the periphery, relatively myopic and a relatively hyperopic signal, optically of course, the more positive signals dominate. Okay, so if you've got some plano power and you've got some plus power in the periphery, the plus power is going to win the day. And finally, as we can see on the slide on the right, and I'm going to show you, sorry about that, Monica. I'm going to show you in some data to come, it's the strategies that have these peripheral components that are really the ones that work. So now let's go on and talk about some of the options. So let's start with orthokeratology, okay? So what are we doing with orthokeratology? Well, we're putting a rigid lens on the eye, having the patient sleep in it, and that flattens the central cornea and temporarily reduces or eliminates their myopia. And quite by chance, we found that this actually at the same time, when you do it in a young child, it slows their progression. And we believe that that's because you've corrected the central vision, but you've left the peripheral retina because the peripheral cornea is still relatively myopic. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. We're reducing the peripheral hyperopia, bathing the peripheral retina in myopic defocus, and that's why this is believed to work. How well does it work? Well, let's look at the next slide. And you can see here the first randomized clinical trial of overnight orthokeratology. And you can see on the right there that the eyes that were fitted with orthokeratology elongate at a slower rate than those who were wearing spectacles. Okay, so you can see this 2-year trial, and you've got about a 0.25 slowing of axial elongation. Okay, now when we look at the next slide, I'm showing you data from one of these dreaded meta-analyses, and I call them dreaded because they proliferate. You've got sort of a never-ending stream of people sort of publishing these things. But what you can see here is data from both randomized clinical trials and cohort studies. And the way these data are plotted is that the trials are sort of stacked up vertically here, and you can compare them very easily. And the big black diamonds at the bottom is kind of the overall treatment effect. But one of the things that you see with overnight orthokeratology that you don't always see in the medical literature is the treatment effect is very consistent across the studies. Okay, there's really very little spread of the data, whether you're looking at randomized clinical trials or whether you're looking at cohort studies. What you see overall over a 2-year period is a slowing of about 0.27 millimeters. So that corresponds to about perhaps 0.7 diopters over 2 years. So a very meaningful effect in terms of what we can achieve with overnight orthokeratology. So if we look at where Ortho-K stands in the grand scheme of things, Ortho-K is the light green data here, and generally it's among the more effective therapies we have available to us, okay? And if we think about it in a broader context, there are various sort of pluses and minuses to Ortho-K. So on the next slide, let's think about what's good and what might not be quite so good, all right? Patients in Ortho-K tend to be very compliant. It's great from the point of view of the parent because the lens goes in at night, the lens comes out in the morning, so a kid isn't going to school with contact lenses, okay? So the other benefit, of course, relates to that. There's a lifestyle benefit. So from the point of view of sports and swimming and other things, you can, the child is correction free. They've been rendered emmetropic in terms of what they need to be wearing throughout the day. So from the point of view of the patient with astigmatism, the patient with allergies, this might be a really good fit. In terms of the downsides, there's a learning curve, there's more chair time involved, and some people are a little squirrely about having kids sleep in contact lenses, particularly our ophthalmology colleagues. They're not a big fan of this modality. There is a small increased risk in microbial keratitis, and I show you the data for that. And particularly in higher levels of myopia, there may be some small compromise to vision, particularly at nighttime or in low contrast conditions. So let's look at some safety data. And I had the good fortune to lead a study some time ago on the next slide, where we did a retrospective study of the safety of Ortho-K. And this was mandated by the Food and Drug Administration. They got a little nervous about the increased use of Ortho-K in kids. So they wanted to know what the incidence of microbial keratitis was in both children and adults who are wearing these corneal reshaping lenses overnight. And the important thing to remember here is that the protocol we used was approved by the FDA, and the results were accepted by the FDA. And in any FDA approved overnight lens, particularly Paragon and anything under the Bausch & Lomb approval, so Euclid and others, you'll find these data in the practitioner information and in the patient booklet. So what did we find? Well, let's look on the next slide. What we found is that we were able to recruit or collect data from over 1,300 patients. Unfortunately, when we did the study, about half of them were children and half were adults. I would wager if we did the study again today in the US, the ratio would be closer to sort of 80 or 90% children. In fact, we published a paper last year with some researchers who are from the east of Ukraine. I won't mention the country. And what we found there is about 85% of the patients were children. But what we found was the two cases that were judged to be microbial keratitis. They both had good outcomes, but both of them occurred in children. So the overall incidence is around 8 per 10,000 years of wear. But in children, it's about 14 per 10,000 years of wear. So let me put that another way. If you fit 750 children with Ortho-K, one of them in that next year would probably get MK. So the rate is still very low. So let's think about another modality. Let's think now about soft contact lenses. So there are a lot of designs here, and the range of designs and the success of those contributes to quite a broad range of efficacy for these particular devices. Some of them are just lenses that have been designed for presbyopia, where you have a center distance design and a near periphery design. Some of them are designed specifically for myopia control. And I'm going to talk about the clinical trial data for all of those. So there's a lot of designs here. On the next slide, as I said, there's a wide range of effect size, a wide range of efficacy because of the range of design, but you can get very good efficacy. And the highest one actually for the MySight lens is around about 0.3 millimeters over 3 years. So let's start by going straight to that graph and look and see where these lenses generally reside. And these soft lenses on the graph here are the red dashed lines. And you can see some of them don't work very well, but some of them work pretty much as well as Ortho-K, particularly the MySight design. But let's think about 3 different clinical trials. And the first one I'm going to talk about on the next slide is a study from Monica's old institution. I'm looking to see whether she's a co-author. She's not. And here the children were randomized to one of 5 different lenses, either a single vision lens or 4 different designs, 2 of which were multifocal designs and 2 of which were extended depth of focus designs. You may be familiar with that phrase EDOF because we hear it in some intraocular lens designs now for presbyopia. So what happened? Well, the control group progressed much as you might expect by about 1 and a bit diopters, and they elongated by about 0.6 millimeters. And the treatment effect in all 4 of those experimental designs was pretty much the same. Over the 2 years, there was a slowing of axial elongation of about 0.15 millimeters and a slowing of myopia progression of about 0.3, 0.4 diopters. So that lenses, or those lenses, are not marketed in the US, but one of the lenses, one of the EDOF designs, is marketed in other parts of the world. So let's go on to the next study. And this, of course, is the MySight clinical trial. They've recently published 8 years of data, and that's an interesting paper to read. But here are the 3-year data. And what you can see is the adjusted slowing of myopia progression was 0.7 diopters and about 0.3 millimeters slowing of axial elongation. And on the next slide, you can see that those 2 are quite well correlated. So this is a scatter plot showing the change in axial length and the change in refractive error, both in the treated and in the untreated eyes. And what you can see is a very good correlation. So if you are prescribing this lens, or if prescribing some of the spectacle lenses I'm going to show you later, you'll expect to see a very good correlation between refractive progression and axial length. So it's perhaps not as critical to measure axial length in these patients. And finally, I want to talk about an off-label use of a contact lens. And these are in this clinical trial, they use the Biofinity multifocal and the Blink study, which was conducted at Ohio State and at Houston by some of my former students, proud moment, where the children were randomly assigned to either a single vision lens or a medium ad bifocal or a high ad bifocal. Okay, and what's very impressive about this study is pretty much 100% of the children completed the 3-year study. That was due in fact, in part to the excellence of the investigators, but also the fact that the children perhaps didn't know what they were wearing and whether they were in the treated or untreated groups. So let's look at the data on the next slide. And what we can see here is that in terms of the first row, the single vision patients progressed by about a diopter over 3 years, and their eyes grew by about 0.6 millimeters. There was a small but non-significant reduction in progression and axial elongation for the medium ad, but a much more robust effect for the high ad. So you can see in red on the last row of the table, the high ad bifocal slowed progression by almost 0.5 of a diopter, and it slowed axial elongation by about 1/4 of a millimeter over 3 years. Okay, so what's nice about this study is not only the excellent subject retention, is that we've got a dose response effect. The higher the ad, the greater the treatment effect. Okay, but even for that highest ad down the bottom, the 250 ad, the effect is not quite as good as the MySight lens. Okay, but if you've got a patient who has astigmatism, these lenses are available in toric form, so this might be an option for you in an off-label use. So let's go on to the next slide, and again go back and look at this. And the top two lines, top two red lines on the graph are the MySight data over 3 years and the Blink data over 3 years, and they stand out because you can see the 3-year data points. So they're among the most effective soft lenses that we have available to us, and a lot of the other lenses have sort of gone by the by and not been brought to market. So let's go on to think about the safety of these lenses. Okay, so before that, let's just think about the pluses and minuses. So for the soft multifocal lenses, a lot of these are available as daily disposable lenses, so that should in theory lower the burden and lower the risk. Young children can wear them, so we can fit children down as young as 7 or 8, and they can manage them. And of course, again, these lenses tend to be very comfortable and offer some lifestyle benefits compared to spectacles. The other good thing, of course, is mum and dad may be wearing soft lenses, so the whole family can do insertion and removal together. So that's really nice. There is a small risk of infection, but again, I would say it's almost negligible. When you do see infections with daily disposables, it appears to be when the kids start sleeping in their lenses, and as a teenager, perhaps they think they know better. In terms of vision quality, it tends to be really good, but when you go to the higher ad multifocal, there may be some challenges there, particularly in the older children. And as I said before, some of these lenses are not available in toric form, but that may, if the child does have some astigmatism, you may have to go off label. Now, in terms of safety, let's get to the next slide here. This is a retrospective study, the CLAY study. This was a group of researchers across schools and colleges of optometry in North America, and they did a really nice retrospective study where they were specifically interested in the rate of adverse events in children, but also comparing them to adolescents and adults. And what you can see is that they rounded up about patients representing over 4,000 patient years of wear. And amongst that, they identified almost 200 corneal infiltrative events, okay? And they were reviewed by a group of adjudicators who didn't know what they were seeing in terms of the age of the child or the age of the patient and the type of lens that they were wearing. So the data on the next slide show the incidence of these corneal infiltrative events in different age groups, okay? And again, on the left, I'm showing you the incidence per 10,000 patient years. And notice the numbers are higher here than we saw for the microbial keratitis, because most of these are things like sort of infiltrative keratitis, CLPUs, things that are far less serious, but occur far more frequently, regardless of the age of the patient. And you can see that there are a couple of microbial keratitis cases in teenagers, adolescents, and adults. But what you can see that is most striking about this graph is that the incidence of all events is very much dependent on the age of the patient. And it has this sort of non-linear effect. The lowest incidence occurs in the 8 to 12-year-olds. And that's important here because those are the children we're going to think about putting into a soft lens modality for myopia control. The risk goes up slightly, but significantly in teenagers. And of course, when you're dealing with college age kids, the wheels completely come off, all right? And the research have shown other data that suggests this is really related to the behavior and the risk taking of the patients in terms of sleeping, showering in lenses, wearing them after they've been drinking or when they've got a cold. So, but the important thing I want you to take from this slide is contact lens wear is safer in young children than in any other age group. Well, that's a retrospective study. What about prospective data? Well, let's look at this. And I published this review paper about 5 years ago. And in that paper, I collected data from not only retrospective studies, but a bunch of prospective studies. And they're summarized on the next slide here. And what you can see is that most of the children here were fit between ages of 8 and 12. There's some older kids in there. And all of these studies have at least 150 patient years. Some of them are very, very large. And I can update this. I should update this table because there are even more studies out there now documenting long-term use of soft lenses in children, and again, very low rates of microbial keratitis. So what you can see in the first 6 columns there, the studies found no cases whatsoever of microbial keratitis. There was just one case in the Blink study, which is in the bottom. So in that particular study, you can say the incidence was 12 per 10,000 years, but combining all of these studies together, the incidence is about 3 per 10,000 years, which is pretty much what you see in adults. Okay, so again, I think this is a very safe modality. So let's go on now to talk about spectacle lenses. And spectacle lenses have a long and checkered history, in part because of the range of designs. And the efficacy of these designs, as you'll see in the next 5 minutes, varies widely from PALs, which are really very ineffective, to some of the new designs, which are impressively effective. So the other thing that I want to point out, first of all, is that the current evidence doesn't support the accommodative theory. And the other thing is that we shouldn't undercorrect our patients, because if anything, that places them at risk of increase in myopia progression. How do we know that? Well, we have 2 randomized clinical trials that I like to talk about. One that was done in Malaysia, one that was done in Israel, but they both evaluated in a randomized clinical trial the effects of undercorrecting the child by 1/2 or 3/4. What did they find? Well, the data on the next slide shows a very consistent story. The data in the open circles are the fully corrected children, or sorry, the open symbols, and the data in the dark or close symbols are the undercorrected children. And what you can see is that the undercorrected children progressed, if anything, a little faster, okay? Now, you'll still get some patients coming in whose parents want you to undercorrect their children, okay? But that's not a good thing to do for 2 reasons. One is it won't slow the progression and may actually accelerate it slightly. And the other thing is they may not be able to see the blackboard at school or see the softball when they're playing sports. So we're doing them a disservice on a number of levels. So don't undercorrect, please. Well, what about bifocals? Again, this has a long history. Those of you associated with Berkeley may recognize the author on the left here, Bob Mandel. And this was work I think he did back in the 50s when he was still a graduate student at Indiana. And he did a retrospective record review of patients who were fit with bifocals and patients who are fit with single vision lenses. And his conclusion on the bottom right there was that the data of the study show that bifocals used on myopic parents in this practice have not eliminated or reduced the progression of myopia beyond what might be expected to happen on a chance basis. So in short, ineffective. Now, like all things go out of fashion, come back into fashion. And about 20 years ago, George Falk and his colleagues from Tahlequah did this very nice small study looking at the effect of flat top bifocals on a group of myopic children who had esophoria. And they had made a compelling case that if bifocals work, they're going to work better in esophores. So they only recruited esophoric patients in this study. What did they find? Well, you can see the overall progression in the bar graph at the top, and it's not particularly compelling. At the bottom there, you can see the mean progression over the 30-month study in the bifocal wearers and the single vision wearers. And looking at the bottom row, you can see that progression in the single vision wearers was about a diopter and a quarter, and progression in the bifocal wearers was about a diopter. So over 30 months of wear, and the child being teased about their bifocals, there was only a quarter diopter slowing of myopia in the flat top wearers. So a potentially statistically significant effect, but one that is really clinically irrelevant. Well, another study on the next slide tried again with executive bifocals. And this time, the study was conducted in a practice in Canada, and they only recruited Chinese Canadian children. Obviously, there's a high sort of Chinese immigrant or Chinese descent population up in that particular area. And they randomized over 100 children to either wearing single vision lenses, plus 150 executive, or a plus 150 executive with 3 base in each segment. What did they find? Well, they found that both of those bifocals slowed myopia by a significant effect. And if we look on the next slide, I'll show you some data. That's what the refractive data look like at the top there. And you can see that both kinds of bifocal, both with and without the prism, slowed myopia considerably. But when you looked at the axial elongation data on the bottom right, really wasn't much difference. Both slowed myopia by about a quarter of a millimeter over the 36 months, okay? So maybe that's something we should be prescribing for our patients. But I often joke, if you're going to prescribe an executive bifocal to a child, you should also give them a t-shirt that says "kick me," because they're about the ugliest pair of glasses that anyone is ever likely to wear. Now, what about progressive addition lenses? And in the field of myopia control, this is probably the most researched area, with the possible exception of atropine. And a lot of this was driven by a report that was published almost 25 years ago out of Hong Kong. It wasn't a randomized trial, but what the results suggested was that over a 2-year period, there was a significant slowing of myopia in children who wore one of 2 flavors of progressive addition lenses. I think the P2 was a +2 ad, and the P1 was a 150 ad. And you can see there that the single vision wearers progressed by about a diopter and a quarter over 2 years, but the progression in the FAAO wearers was significantly less. And that was kind of the face that launched 1,000 ships. A lot of randomized clinical trials of PALs were conducted partly on the base of this finding. And two of the ones that were first published found really the opposite result. One was conducted, the one on the left, in Hong Kong, same institution as the previous study. And the one on the right was the COMET study, which was a large study conducted in the US at schools and colleges of optometry. And what you can see is the results are rather similar. The 2-year study on the left from Hong Kong, a slowing of myopia of less than 0.2 diopters. On the right, a slowing again of about 2 diopters over 3 years. But interestingly, and consistent with what I showed you earlier, pretty much all of that treatment effect occurred in the first year. So after that, the lines are parallel. So there was no additional value in wearing the PAL beyond that first year of treatment. So a statistically significant effect, but one that is really clinically worthless in the context of slowing myopia in your practice. That's a lot of expense and work to go through to get less than a quarter diopter effect. Now, there was a subgroup analysis conducted by the researchers, and that's shown here. When you get a non-significant or a non-meaningful treatment effect, we all want to go and look at the data and say, well, are there groups of children in which it might work better? Okay, that's commonly done. It's called a post hoc analysis, sometimes called a fishing expedition. And what they did here is they divided the children into 6 groups based on whether they were orthophoric, esophoric, or exophoric. Remember, there had been some suggestion that the ESO patients might respond better. And they also looked at the accommodative lag of the patients, whether it was below or greater than about a half a diopter. And what they found was that one group of patients, the one on the far left, seemed to respond better. So when you compared the PAL wearers and the single vision wearers who had esophoria and a larger than average accommodative lag, you seem to show a much more robust treatment effect on the far left there, okay? Now, some people look at this and say, ha, we should prescribe PALs in these myopes who have esophoria and accommodative lag. But the researchers, of course, were much more rigorous about this. So they did another study on the next slide, where they actually repeated the 3-year study, but only recruited children with esophoria and a larger than average accommodative lag. Okay, so they tested the hypothesis that came from that post hoc analysis. What did they find? Pretty much the same result as the original study. Maybe a little bit higher treatment effect. You know, it's slightly above a quarter diopter, but again, it's still not clinically meaningful. Okay, it's still really not what we could be doing for our myopic patients. So, as I said, this has been a very well-researched area. And on the next slide, I've summarized, I think it's 8 or 9 studies here that have looked at the effects of PALs, okay? And these are the 1-year treatment effect. And the blue lines at the top are studies that recruited all myopes. And the studies at the bottom are the ones who recruited just myopic esophores. And what you can see is there's a unimpressive effect across the board here. And it doesn't matter whether you recruit all myopes or whether you only recruit myopes with esophoria, it's all the same treatment effect, a very modest treatment effect. Well, let's go back to the science behind optical correction. And remember, the things that appear to work are the things that work in the periphery, okay, or things that operate in the periphery. So, of course, it makes sense that we should try and design some lenses that perhaps leave the central vision intact, but produce some myopic defocus around the periphery. So let's look at the first study to try that. So this was a study out of BHVI again. I'm looking to see whether Monica was on this one. No, I think she was too young to be on this paper. But anyway, what the researchers did here was they randomized a group of myopic children to either single vision, that's the control data on the left of the graph, or one of three types of lenses where the plus power increased gradually towards the periphery of the lens. So these, if you like, are concentric PALs or concentric multifocals where you've got a gradual increase in plus power towards the edge. So these are generally rotationally symmetric. Well, if you look at the data on the right, they look fairly unimpressive. Okay, there doesn't seem to be much difference between the control group and the three experimental lenses on the right. But when you look at type 3, that seemed to be the most effective lens. And when they did a subgroup analysis again, they found that if you only looked at the younger children and those who had at least one myopic parent, you perhaps got a slightly more impressive treatment effect. So that lens was actually marketed in parts of the world, but a group of Japanese researchers on the next slide did a subsequent evaluation. 200 children, low myopes, with at least one myopic parent, and they were randomized for 2 years, either to that single vision lens or to this now marketed lens, the MyoVision lens, which was basically that type 3 from the previous study. What did they find? Nothing. It's an ineffective therapy, which unfortunately is still used in some part of the world. But this is, if you like, an example of a failed attempt to produce a myopia control lens. Now, fortunately, some good things have happened more recently. So this lens, which was developed at the Hong Kong Polytechnic U, if you look at the bottom paragraph there, it's a lens called the Defocus Incorporated Multiple Segments Spectacle Lens, or the DIMS lens for short, okay? And this, as you can see by the shadow picture, go back one, Monica, thanks, on the right, it has a series of little segments arranged around the periphery of the lens, okay? So it's called the DIMS lens. And I've heard, in fact, that in China, they're working on a second version of the DIMS lens, and they're calling it the dim sum lens. So thank you. I'm here all day. All right, let's look at the data, Monica. So the researchers randomized almost 200 children to wear either a single vision lens or the DIMS lens. And what they found is that in the single vision lens, they got fairly typical progression. Diopter progression over 2 years, 0.5 millimeter axial elongation, but it was significantly less in the DIMS lens. And if you look at the numbers in red, there was about a 0.5 diopter slowing and about a 0.3 millimeter slowing of axial elongation. Okay, so a really nice, robust treatment effect over 2 years. Now, there's another lens that's been developed, which has a somewhat similar design. And this, what we call the aspherical lenslets design. So if you give me one more click there, Monica, there we go. These lenses have lenslets arranged in these concentric patterns. And the secret sauce here is that not only are these lenses containing plus power, but they also have different degrees of asphericity. And I won't go into the science underlying that today. But what you can see here is that when children were randomized either to single vision, the highly aspherical lenslets, or the slightly aspherical lenslets, you see that there's a slowing in both groups, but a very dramatic slowing in the HAL lens, the highly aspheric lens. Now, just in the last month or so, the researchers have published 2-year data on this lens. Let's go to the next slide. So these data were published recently in JAMA Ophthalmology, and these are they've got a really good retention of subjects here over a 2-year trial. And again, look at the HAL data. This is the highly aspherical lens. You've got a 0.8 diopter slowing of myopia progression and over a 0.3 millimeter slowing of axial elongation. So again, very promising. Unfortunately, it's going to be a few years before these lenses are available in the US, but Stephanie can already prescribe them in Canada, probably, right? Both of these, the DIMS and the HAL lens. So good for her. So going back to our summary graph, I've plotted the data here for spectacles. They are the two studies I just talked about, and near the top, they are the blue dotted lines. Okay, thanks for waving the cursor around, Monica. The third one is at the bottom there, or the third line is for the executive bifocal study. But these lenses look very promising when you put them up against other modalities. So as I said, we're very excited to get our hands on those technologies, but it may be a while in the US. So let's make some summary comments here. PALs, clinically ineffective. Executive bifocals may work, but they're butt ugly. The real things that are going to be making a difference for our patients are this new generation of technologies, which are very promising. A word of caution about the executive bifocals and the other technologies. They were the result of single site, single investigator studies. So it'll be nice to see some more data on those in the years to come. So spectacle lenses, good and bad. Well, they're safe, well expected, something that we could put any young child into, particularly if there's an aversion to contact lenses or eye drops. We can incorporate astigmatism correction in there. The other thing that we may have some limitations here, obviously cosmetically, particularly the executive bifocals, there's some cosmetic problems, but for both the DIMS and the HAL lens, it's very difficult to notice the child wearing them. And Stephanie may be able to share some experiences on that in a few minutes. So let's go on to talk about atropine, and I'm going to finish here, and I should probably finish in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So we know that 1% atropine works. So data from the ATOM study here showed that atropine over 2 years slowed myopia by about a diopter, and it slowed axial elongation by about 0.4 millimeters. And in the grand scheme of things, that's still the biggest or most effective treatment that we have available to us. However, there's a downside. If we look at the next slide, with atropine 1%, we see a profound rebound. And when the children were taken off the atropine, there was a dramatic progression in the following year that was almost as much as the untreated eyes in the first year. So that's one of the problems with high concentration atropine. The other, of course, is it produces profound cycloplegia and dilation. So the investigators went on and did a study called ATOM-2. And what they found, somewhat surprisingly, is that across all 3 concentrations of atropine, there was a slowing of myopia that kind of approached the high concentration atropine. Okay, so that was potentially very exciting, but there's a problem here. So if we go on the next slide, there's a disagreement between the refractive error data and the axial elongation data. So I've highlighted the author's data with the placebo data in green and the 0.01% data in red. And you can see that there's a difference for the refractive error, but for axial elongation, the lines overlap. So that's kind of a problem with these data. Now, fortunately, we've had a number of other studies that have sort of cleared up this particular confusion. Perhaps the most meaningful is the next study, is the LAMP study, where they looked at placebo and then 3 different concentrations of atropine, 0.05, 0.025, and 0.01. And if we look on the next slide, we can see that there's a nice dose response effect for both spherical equivalent on the left and the atropine, sorry, the axial length on the right. But importantly here, the 0.01% is really not very effective. It only slows myopia by about 0.2 diopters in the first year, and only slows axial elongation by around about 0.05. So since then, there's been a number of studies, a number of randomized clinical trials looking at low concentration atropine. And I've summarized those for you on the next slide. So on the left, you can see the ATOM study, where you've got this disconnect between the gray bar, which is slowing of myopia progression, or care if you like, and on the white bar, the slowing of axial elongation. Again, we would talk about that as the care. But the other 5 studies subsequent to that were done in Hong Kong, China, India, and Japan, they all show a remarkably similar effect. 0.2 diopter slowing or less, and less than 0.1 millimeter slowing of axial elongation. And what I've plotted on the right there is the FAAO data from the COMET study. So those are on the right there, that's progressive edential lenses, which I've already tried to convince you is an ineffective therapy. And what I'm trying to convince you here is that if you use an atropine, 0.01% is not enough, okay? So let me try and convince you of that just with one slide further. So these are data from the LAMP study, and these are patients who are treated over 3 years, and you can ignore the green line, but the blue line, let's go to the next slide, Monica, because I think labels it. The blue line is 0.05%, and the orange line at the bottom is 0.01%. Okay, and these are just treated eyes. There's no control data here. But what you can see here is that both groups progress. Okay, both groups elongate. All right, but I've labeled this the wrong way around. That should be 0.05 at the bottom and 0.01 at the top. Shit, sorry about that. Anyway, bottom line is there's a 0.4 millimeter difference between the 0.01 at the top and the 0.05 at the bottom. Okay, so the 0.05 is clearly far more effective over 3 years than the 0.01. I'll need to fix that slide for the next time. I apologize for that. So let's summarize what we know about atropine on the next slide. Okay, we're not 100% clear about how it works, but we know it doesn't work via accommodation. It works at the retina level. With low concentrations, we get relatively good tolerance. But again, what I would recommend that you do here is be the doctor, okay? Start the treatment with atropine and see how well it's tolerated. If you're worried about going with a higher concentration, why don't you start the kid on one eye and see them in 2 weeks or a month and see how much accommodation they've got left and how much pupil dilation. Okay, so think about being the doctor there. Again, looking at the next slide, we can see that high concentration atropine is very effective at the top, but the 0.01% is among the least effective things available to us. We've got to find something in the middle, and that's up to you as the doctor to stay up to date on the literature and to figure out what works best for your patients. All right, I've talked about pluses and minuses. The biggest limitation to atropine treatment for myopia is you still need to correct the refractive error, okay? So unlike all the other things I've talked about, you've still got to prescribe something. So if you're going to prescribe something, why not prescribe something good? Finally, let's talk about combination therapy. So I don't have a great deal of data to show you here, except to note that many practitioners will start a patient on an optical therapy, and if they're not getting a good enough effect, they'll add atropine. And there's going to be a proliferation of data in the coming years looking at the effects of combining atropine with optical therapies. We've got some data on Orthokeratology already, a little bit of data for multifocal soft lenses, but this is a growth area. But to emphasize what I've been saying all along here, on the next slide, I want to give you the message that you need to personalize your management. You need to be the doctor, figure out what's best for your patient, and figure out when you need to add or change things, okay? This isn't a one-size-fits-all. You may have a primary therapy that becomes your go-to, but you need to be ready to pivot and offer alternatives to some of your patients. So one slide to summarize here before I pass over to Stephanie. Myopia is a disease, and there's no safe level. Every diopter we can control matters. And the way we do that depends on the child. Don't wait to establish progression. All myopic children progress. If this child in your chair happens to be one that doesn't progress, you should be treating them anyway because you claim that as a success. But you need to monitor and you need to pay attention over time to axial length. And you as practitioners really, hold the future in your hands here because you really have the potential to make a huge difference. And now Stephanie is going to tell you how she goes about it in her practice and talk about her own experience.
Thank you, Mark, for that. I'm really glad you went over all the research. There's coming from a research background and then moving directly into full-time clinical, there's this balance between bringing the research into practice. And I think the way you communicate with your patients, specifically the parents, are really going to be how you get started with myopia management in your practice and allow it to grow. So when it comes to, like in my case, for example, I had no patient base to begin with, but for all of you guys or a good chunk of you guys that potentially have already established practices, go back into your last month's worth of patients if you're not already practicing myopia management right now. You likely may find existing myopic patients or patients that have shown progression over the years in your practice. Make note that when they come back for their next exam, that you are going to be maybe introducing some sort of myopia management, whether it be clinical education or whether it be initiation of management therapy. And so that's the easiest place to start, regardless of whether or not you fully can incorporate all the research items that you've heard of today. So the education doesn't necessarily have to be just for those patients that have children that have myopia, for example. I find that even if I have young myopic parents, and both of them have either a prescription that's 4 and above, let's say, or they have one parent that has high myopia, one parent that has low myopia, I find that that's a great place to initiate the conversation as well. Because whether or not they have children at that time or going forward, that is something you want to plant the seed. Conversely, they may already have a child that has myopia, and if that child already does, maybe there's a 4-year-old sibling or younger sibling that's there. So you want to educate, because sometimes parents don't even realize that kids as young as, let's say, 6 months, years of age should be getting their eyes checked. So you likely may have these subgroups of families that you can be monitoring over time, whether it's planting the seed for myopia management, initiating it at that point, or going ahead and following up with the patient that you've already started treatment for. I think it's really important to set up a referral network. So if you are within your own community, there could be within, let's say, like a 5-kilometer radius, what practices are doing myopia management. I mean, this is as simple as doing like a Google search for practices in your area. Who's offering myopia management? Is it comprehensive? Maybe it's just focusing on one modality as opposed to the range modalities that we have right now at our disposal. And so you can be able to categorize and essentially customize the type of myopia management that you're providing for your practice if you want to have that be a good component to your practice. I find referral forms are really great. So I'll have other optometrists referring in for myopia management of their patients, whether it's a case maybe that's beyond the level of myopia that they're, comfortable with controlling, or maybe they've tried one modality and it doesn't meet that particular patient's needs to slow down their myopia, and they want to go on to a different modality. These referral forms are, we refer a lot to our colleagues for areas of specialty, but less so interprofessionally between optometrists. So I find that having these forms, I keep them on the website for my particular practice. Is a great way that I am building my patient base. And then continuum of care, so I send a report back to these practitioners if they're sending the patient over, because that's the way we can keep that level of communication open. So report back on what treatment was used, how the patient's progressing. In the case of patients that, for example, are being sent to you, let's say for atropine treatment, or they're doing a refractive form of treatment such as Orthokeratology, they probably will stay within your practice because you're now monitoring them going forward. You still want to at least follow up and let that practitioner know what steps you took in order to care for that particular patient. If we go on the next slide and we talk about communicating to our patients, I mean, it would be great to show some of the colorful charts. I do have a lot of like pictorial diagrams, which are my think maps. If we go down certain paths, you can see which modality might be best for a particular child. But I find that at the very minimum, like say, for example, a parent comes in with their child for an annual exam, and just describing what refractive error is, using my eye model, showing where light enters into the eye, showing where light's supposed to enter for the brain to process clear vision, showing what happens in myopia, and then using that as kind of my education points. I can't necessarily always get it all into that baseline exam, but if I start describing some of the potential risks associated with either initially, in my case, because it's a new practice, initially found myopia, or I have some patients that are coming in that they have already established spectacle lens where we know that they're progressing from the previous number. And so we show them like using something as simple as the eye model itself, or maybe even just drawing it out on a whiteboard or a piece of paper, at least let the parent understand how that eye is changing and what happens when light enters the eye. So we can break it down so it could be very simple for a parent to understand. One of the biggest questions I always get is, my child's been going to the doctor, they've been getting new spectacles year after year. Why am I only hearing about this now? And I will say in the last 2 years, probably within COVID, there's been a drastic increase in the incorporation of myopia management across practices here in Ontario specifically. We are still finding parents are wanting to hear more about it. And so I think if you can't get all the information in that initial exam, go ahead and follow up with a patient in a secondary exam. So whether or not you're doing, like in my case, I do a separate myopia management consultation visit. And in that visit, we go ahead, we break down all the risks that might be associated with that particular patient. And then we talk about what are the next steps for a plan. So the parent has a chance to digest maybe some information we talked about during our initial examination, and then move forward into whatever questions that they might have in that subsequent visit. I always like to follow up my exam that I'm doing with patients with a follow-up email. Easy for me to say when it's in a style like a building practice, but I get it when you have a jam-packed filled day. This is something you can delegate to staff in your office, because once you create kind of the base of the email, they may just need to update a few of the pieces. So for example, thank you for trusting us for the care of Jill today. Jill has X number for the myopia. This equates to number of units of change in the eye for myopia. If Jill stays at the age of 6 with this level, where do we expect Jill to be in X number of years? So I like to break that down, and then that way the parent has something that they can at least have to take home from the examination there. When I say to whether or not we're going to initiate a treatment plan or whether we are going to observe, so that if that parent comes back, let's say, and they are still on the fence, as to whether or not you've planted all the seeds, you've given all the research, and they're still not sure on what they want to do. To Monica's point that she brought up earlier, that every diopter counts, I completely agree. But sometimes these patients and our parents are apprehensive. So know that even if they're apprehensive and they're very strict on not wanting to do anything right now, bring them back for a follow-up and just say, okay, let's see where your child is. Although you might strongly believe that now is the time to act, give them a time to think about it and see where the child is in a few months if you're going to initiate treatment. So if we move on to further communication tools, what can we use? So we saw the effect of the calculators. I really like using the calculators because they're visual, they're colorful, they're easy ways for us to plug in the prescription of a patient at whatever particular age. I understand how Mark was saying too, you got to use it with a grain of salt because of the multiple factors that are involved. But with parents, they like to see kind of the bottom line, where exactly, if I'm going to initiate this treatment for my child, where am I going to see the benefit? How long is it going to be before I see the benefit? And what exactly is the purpose of initiating treatment now? Most of you can have certain instrumentation, for example, that incorporates software-based projections. Not every practice is going to be able to use these or have available these resources to them, but it can be useful and beneficial if you have access. At the very minimum, if you have retinal photography, I even find it effective to take a picture of, like, say, a parent that has a myopic prescription. You'll see kind of that tigroid fundus. You might see some changes of the optic nerve. And that's easy for them to see. And it's not a normal retinal photo that's their retinal photo, but I'll always show them the comparison to understand, like, there's changes in your eyes, and your child can move down that road into having changes as well. So the more you can educate, I find that it's really good to have these parents go along the way. And whether or not there's existing retinal myopic disease, I'll talk to you about it in a case in just a moment. A -16 diopter father. So they are definitely on board. They may not have heard of it, but they're still more inclined to make changes if they themselves are going through a path of high myopia. So if we move on to the next slide, and we talk about the flow of the clinic. So you can take all your measurements during your baseline exam, like I said, but you don't always have the time to incorporate, besides the refractive error components that you do. If you're going to take keratometric readings, maybe you get them from an auto-K reading, but the topography may not be until a subsequent measurement for that particular patient. If you are doing it for a specific treatment modality. So you can really incorporate this very fast in your general eye exam, as opposed to having there be a sequence of tests that are needed. And at that point, like I said, I think it's always worthwhile. Give the parent a chance to digest the information, give them information to go home with, and then have them come back for a separate follow-up where you just focus on the myopia. If, like I said, you set up that referral network, I do have some parents that are strictly coming in for myopia management consultation visits. So it really just depends how you sequence it, and then how many staff members you get involved. Always have, so some of the research that we talked about today obviously has certain age ranges where the treatment modalities go from. There are some that are on label and off label, and so that's why the informed consent comes into play. I think it's important for parents to sign off and understand why it is they're treating their child with this particular form. And then when it comes to breaking down the fee schedule, that really is up to you and how you want to define it for your practice, but there's different ways that you can incorporate it there. Just make sure you account for your chair time depending on what modality that you're using. If we move on, and we now actually talk about the first case. So this particular patient is an 11-year-old child. So we know when they're in the spectrum of myopia progression, this child is over the age of 10, Caucasian, doesn't have any parental myopia that is present. So again, these are factors that would be more so on the side that we would just we wait and observe for this patient. It's the first time I'm seeing this patient, so I know there's no particular progression. The parents report that they've noticed that the child's been squinting. This is all this kind of post-COVID, these kids are coming out and their parents are realizing that, oh, okay, they really you know, when everything was within arm's length during the last 2 years, they go back to school and they can't see now the board. So while there's most likely signs of progression in this particular prescription, this is now a first eye exam for the parents with my practice. So he's never had a prescription before. And you can see with the refractive error there is, it's a low myopic prescription. He likes to video game. He has online schooling still at that point in time. And axial length is still below that 24 millimeter amount. So there's not any strong, you know, side here as to whether or not you're going to observe and treat. But because after we go through all of the education pieces, this patient's still along the lines of having risk factors that would lead to, they're low risk factors, but it's still worthwhile to treat at this point. So if we can keep this patient, let's say, for example, below a 24 millimeter axial length, I would say we did a job well done. So we proceeded with fitting this patient with soft contact lenses for myopia management. And I think the biggest thing with parents is what age is a child ready for contact lens wear? And the thing is, I don't really think there is an age. I know what some studies show as young as 7 to 8 years old. I've had some children wear contact lenses that are 6. To me, it's the maturity age, level. If if they're in the chair and they're not picking their nose, or they're not they're attentive to what you're saying to them. I always ask, does the child like make their bed every day? Do they brush their teeth? Do they have established routine in their life? I do think that those make them a good contact lens candidate. This particular patient had, he understood that there was a need for spectacle use. He did understand that he had this condition called nearsightedness, and he did understand while we went through it that there were options that could be used to slow it down. He did play baseball, and so using the contact lenses were an option for him to be free of spectacle lenses. And so we went with a dual focus concentric design lens. In this particular patient, so the prescription that I showed did have a little bit of refractive astigmatism, but we were able to fit a spherical design, because that can be a limitation with some of the designs that are available, where you cannot correct for astigmatism above a certain amount. In this particular case, low myope, still has some astigmatism. We were able to achieve the refractive endpoint, and then we were able to add glasses at the same time. In this particular case, they wanted to go back and forth between spectacle wear and contact lens wear, and so we ended up doing a spectacle lens for myopia management as well. So you don't be afraid to go back and forth, even if they're not using it full time, even if they use the contact lens for a, not for, ideally you want them to use it every day, but sometimes these patients want to have the variety. And so you want to make sure they have a backup option at the same time. We move on to the next case. So this, we talked earlier about the genetics of it. So this is the family that I talked about. You have a 40-year-old mom, 41-year-old dad. You can see the high level of myopia in the father, with a very long axial length, in where we are seeing that it's very off from our baseline level of less than 24 millimeters that we know of. I'll have a lot of patients come in where they'll say, my myopia is corrected, I had LASIK. I think it's really important to educate that LASIK doesn't mean your myopia went away. So I always ask, what was your pre-LASIK measurement, to understand how much the child is at risk, because both parents are having high myopia can go ahead, or moderate to high myopia, of course, puts that child at an even greater risk. In this particular case, I did not see the patient in August 2020. They came with that established prescription. When they came in May of 2021, you can see that there already was that progression that was indicated there. And then you can see there's an axial length. Lifestyle factors are always important to consider. Online schooling, had some outdoor time, but ideally we want 2 hours. It's hard to do that here in the wintertime as well. So that's something to keep in mind. And so with this particular case, we move on to the next slide. It wasn't hard for us to talk about what myopia was, because that both parents had been hearing about it. I ended up doing and this is something anybody can do. I'm noticing that more and more parents have the same questions. You know, I've had glasses for X number of years, they kept changing, and no one's really talked about what I can do. So I ended up doing a video chat with this family where we educated on some of the questions that they had. And I included that as part. I know Mark was talking earlier about the politics on social media, but I do find it's a really effective way to communicate with parents. So I'm not necessarily using it to give clinical you know, information as opposed to this is how you treat, but more so here's an information session with parents and for parents. So I do find that that's the effective way. And so what we decided to do was go ahead with spectacle lenses for myopia management. Canada, we're a little bit fortunate here, I will say, where we have both the aspheric lenslet design, we've got the DIMS research that Mark talked about earlier. We also have diffusion optic technology that is available. So we've got multiple, I'm not going to get into the research of them either, but we have multiple options that are available us to here. And so whichever your and they have been shown to have similar efficacy. And so however you choose to incorporate them into practice, with this particular patient, we went with diffuse optics technology. And so in that dot technology for that particular patient, there are certain ones where you can see the treatment effect on the spectacle lens. In our case, we used that as an advantage because this child understood, I can see the treatment in my glasses. I understand that this treatment's different from my friend who's wearing glasses as well. I know I need to wear these glasses all the time. You need to make sure you're incorporating the prescription using the proper measurements for the actual lens specifications, as well. Talk to parents about having a backup pair because they are expensive. And when you get into just getting a first pair of lenses, getting a backup pair can be, very costly for patients. And so for the parents specifically, so it's something that's important to keep in mind when you're thinking about treatment modality. If we move on to the last case, this one is, so we talked a little bit about a family that knew nothing about myopia coming in. We talked about a family that had it in the family, understood that it could spread through the family members, but didn't really know where. Nothing had, none of this research was available to them. You'll also find these patients where mom walks in, and I say mom because it's usually mom, and they already know exactly what they want. They've read about you before they even walk through your door. They want to make sure that they are bringing their child to somewhere where it is safe for them to ask their questions and, effective. They believe they can get an effective treatment amount. You can see the NISO in this particular patient. You can see that there is also a change the progression for this particular patient. And so you can see that the parent and the patient decided to go ahead with orthokeratology. And so in this case, you have to consider the limits of your orthokeratology treatment. We know that certain prescriptions have kind of ceilings based on the approvals for some of these products, but if the patient can be successfully fitted based on the topography readings, and if you want to go into a custom contact lens design for Ortho-K versus maybe a fitting set, that really is whatever's comfortable for you. But this patient really knew what they wanted to go ahead the parent wanted to know what they wanted to do for the 8-year-old female. So history of progression at that particular time, make sure you rule out that there's no pathological conditions that's causing such a high myopia. Remember, if they're like 5 and younger and they're still having that high amount, maybe consider consulting with a pediatric ophthalmologist to make sure that you don't have any type of pathological issue as to why the patient is at that level. And at that point, if the kid is still progressing, so if I would still see progression at that, we don't have much research on there now, but it's included, would I potentially increase and add adjunctive therapies such as atropine? So that's something that I would consider adding in these particular cases as well. So those are some of the cases that I wanted to include. This particular one was really effective, also showing for them photography. you can easily see here that there is a change in the retinal presentation in order for the patients to understand that we need to do something to treat. So again, and this is a very extreme case where the parents knew that they wanted to have treatment, but use your pieces of the puzzle together, build the story for your parent and the patient, follow up if they don't want to treat right now, and then understand that they'll be with you probably for some time as you continue to monitor their children. So I think that leaves us for, oh, sorry, I wanted to also include this before we get to any questions. When I talked about whether or not you have the child ready for soft contact lens wear, the original Ortho-K lens wear patient, in this particular patient here in this case, if the child has, like, say for example, I've had it before where the child was not in a stable home environment, they were in a one home half the week, one home in the other week, that is something that might also ring a red flag to me. Does the child have enough supply to be able to successfully get the lenses in depending on the location? Can they be followed up with a certain, the follow-up schedule to make sure Ortho-K can be met? Those are all things. I know mom wants to do it, but if there's certain aspects that don't meet, if they can't meet any of the sequence to make it successful Ortho-K, that might limit your effective treatment. And that's, do we have any questions now besides communicating? I think we can move on to the questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that excellent discussion on the patient cases. And of course, Professor Mark Bullimore, you're a superstar as usual. So are there any questions from the audience?
I think I saw some questions.
So I can see there's a few questions in there. So the question number one is, if the parent declines myopia management due to cost and then later is able to start when the child is 16 or 17 years old, is that too late to even be slightly effective? So what do you tell your patients, Stephanie, if that happens?
So I think it's because I keep going. Whether it's I send emails, they will decline myopia management, but I will just tell them to come back for a follow-up. And if I go ahead and send an email, like I said, it keeps that level of communication open. I know that I tried to initiate some form of treatment. I have patients that are 18 years old and still progressing. I still find that there's value if they come back to you at 16 and 17 years old and they're a little bit older, and there is myopic changes, or by all means, I say go for it. Yeah.
Professor Mark Bullimore actually published a paper in this. So he did a study that reported that there was about 30% of young adults were progressing with myopia, so in university age. And then other studies have reported that, you know, half the cases of kids diagnosed later in their teenage years tend to progress as well. So if there are risk factors, such as someone still studying at university intensely, and they might be young adults, combined with these risk factors, I wouldn't see any reason why you wouldn't provide some form of myopia management, because if they're myopic, they still need to see in the distance. So having that combination makes it is evidence-based. Any comments on that, Professor Bullimore?
I'll agree with most of the things you said. I do think it depends on the individual patient. So monitoring their progression, monitoring their elongation. Where are they in the myopic spectrum? Because if they're, you know, at the low end, if they're only about a -2, even if they're still progressing, treatment, I would say, is optional. But if they're a higher myope who are still progressing, then I absolutely think that you should consider treatment the older age, you know, even into college age. I mean, the soundbite I like to give people is 50% of myopes are progressing, are still progressing beyond the age of 15, and 25% are still progressing at the age of 18. So need to be in it for the long haul. But remember, there will be the other side of the coin, and there'll be some myopes who stabilize in their early teens. So treat every patient individually with my message.
The second question from the audience is, are there any performance effects in sports when peripheral blur is induced? Have you seen that at all, Dr. Ramdas?
I haven't. So in practice, I don't have a metric to measure that. But I mean, for a lot of these patients, I have kids that are, let's say, in a soft lens modality for myopia management, or they're in Ortho-K. They thrive in their sports activities. So whether it's figure skating, like I said, I have a baseball player, I have a hockey player. They actually see this as a competitive edge to their treatment effect. And so they have other other like teammates that might be doing it as well. So I haven't seen any research yet to show that. I don't know if Mark might pull that out.
Yeah, we actually published some research on this. So with one of those new peripheral designs, it was the HAL design. We did a number of series of careful measurements. We measured peripheral vision using contrast sensitivity, motion detection, attention, and there was no effect of the lens. Now, the only time you can get a small effect is when if you turn your head and look through the periphery. There's a small reduction, maybe a half a line lower visual acuity, maybe a little more reduction in low contrast. So, if you've got a kid who's playing cricket or playing softball where they're turning their head and maybe looking through the periphery of the lens, that may be a challenge. But generally, as you said, Stephanie, the kids adapt to all of these options, whether it's a multifocal soft lens, a new spectacle lens technology. But again, be aware of that if they are doing certain sports where they might be sighting through the periphery of the lens.
And also, with the contact lens treatments, I was involved in a lot of those clinical trials back at the Brian Holden Vision Institute. So we would assess children's vision with the EDOF lenses and other contact lens designs to slow myopia progression. And, we'd assess that under different lighting conditions, different level of contrast of letters. And the children all tend to report really good vision. I mean, the vision may not be exactly the same as the single vision lens, but children are happy. They didn't drop out of the trials either. And, it's not just about visual acuity, it's the subjective kind of vision responses, how they feel with the lenses. Do they like the vision when they're outside walking around? So asking subjective questions, and kids were really happy. So we're doing a really positive thing, giving them these different options. And I think, it's all about personalizing the treatment as to what the lifestyle of the child is and their age and preferences and maturity. So there's another question from the audience. Are there any studies for myopia management starting later than age 13? Professor Bullimore?
Well, there are relatively few. But one of note is the 6-year MySight paper. So you remember for the 3 years of the MySight trial, children were randomized to either MySight or single vision. But then for an additional 3 years, everybody got put into the MySight lens. So the average age of the children then was 13 years from 11 to 15. And the lens still seemed to be effective at slowing progression in that older age group. So one of the challenges for Stephanie and other people in practice is you're often extrapolating data from a limited range or a limited age or a limited race of children. But I think there's good reason to still believe that these modalities work. And I think we need to wrap up.
Yeah, so I'll just add, there have been studies, I guess, that even looked retrospectively, with Ortho-K. Well, there was the 7-year study in Ortho-K and then retrospectively looking at 10 years. So they have followed these kids into their late teen years, I would say. And the treatments appear to be working quite well. So I think we're getting the the message to wrap up now. So I'd like to thank our audience for staying with us this whole time. We really, really enjoyed speaking to you all and reaching out with the latest information. It's been a pleasure to be here with Professor Mark Bullimore and Dr. Stephanie Ramdas sharing their expert insights. Enjoy the rest of the meeting.